My name is Ashley Palmer, and I'm the Conservation Education Specialist at the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. And I am the Envirothon Coordinator for Fairfax County. And assuming you're here at our local training, you are also one of the teams or one of the coaches or one of the students participating in the Fairfax County Envirothon this year. So if you have any questions about how our local competition is going to look this year or anything like that, you can please feel free to direct those my way. And then we also have some amazing presenters here today to talk to us a little bit about soils and forestry. I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jim McGlone, and he has a PhD in human ecology or economics from Virginia Tech and a master's certificate in environmental law and policy from the USDA Graduate School. He's taught economics at Virginia Tech, Ohio State, and Northern Illinois University, and has done research at the Economic Research Service of the USDA. He's a self-taught naturalist and ecologist, and he's managed the natural resources of a 500-acre park in Fairfax County, and is currently an urban forest conservationist with the Virginia Department of Forestry in Northern Virginia, also a mouthful title. Jim is also a long-standing Envirothon judge and presenter, so we've had him join us for many years, and I'm very happy to have him join us again. And with that, Jim, I've made you the presenter. Feel free to begin your presentation, and any questions can go in the chat box.
As Ashley said, my name is Jim McGlone. I work for the Virginia Department of Forestry. I've been doing this for 16 years now. I remember the first time they asked me to, about 3 months after or 2 months after I started, and I went, "What is Envirothon?" Well, now I know. So when I put this training together, I followed the 4 subject elements for forestry, and we're just going to kind of go through those one by one. We're going to start with tree physiology and tree and shrubs identification. I'm not going to talk too much about tree and shrub identification. That's something you're going to have to work on your own. It's a really tough thing to try and teach, especially virtually, because I can't see your faces and know what you're understanding what I'm talking about. But also, one of the most important parts of it is a good map, and I don't know how to teach you to have one of those. But we will talk about the parts and tissues of the tree. I'm not going to talk too much about the life cycle of the tree. I'm sure you all understand that trees start as seeds, they germinate, they put out roots, they put out shoots, they keep growing for many years. They are a perennial woody plant, so they're continually putting down. Essentially, every year they grow a new plant on top of the framework of the old plant. Eventually, they mature, they produce seed. They get old, they die, they decompose, and they fertilize the soil for the next generation of trees. And Dan talked a lot about what happens with organic matter in the soils. But we will talk about some of these other things. So, first of all, this is what a tree looks like. A lot of the pictures, including one of the pictures in one of the study guides they recommend, the artist gets lazy, draws the top of the tree, and then he just turns it over for the root system. That's not the case. The tree has got a very definite three-dimensional, you could think of this as sort of a sphere, whereas the root system is a disc. There are some similarities. You have in the crown of the tree, you have what we call scaffold branches. These are the major branches that hold up the crown of the tree. At the base of the tree, you have big buttress roots that are attached to the trunk that hold the tree up. Then you get into smaller and smaller branches. That would be the structural roots and the anchor roots. These things that go down deeper are called anchor roots. Their function is to hold the tree in place. In the crown, you finally get out past the twigs and into the leaves, which is where very important physiological processes called photosynthesis is taking place. In the root system of the tree, we have fine absorbing roots, and Dan already in the trees are putting a lot of organic matter into the soil. Those fine absorbing roots are not the ones you see when you dig in the soil with those little tiny roots. The fine absorbing roots are actually attached to those roots. These are what take up the water and nutrients, and all of the roots are taking up oxygen because you have lenticels, which are small pores in the epidermis, take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. But those fine absorbing roots are reaching out to little pockets of water or nutrients. They're absorbing them. Once they're done absorbing them, they break off and they get left behind in the soil. And the tree is growing and shedding those fine absorbing roots in a mass equal to or greater than the leaf fall at the end of the growing season. The types of tissue in the tree, there are 3 types. There's meristem, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. Meristem are the cells that are capable of division and differentiation. And think of these as the stem cells of the tree. And there are 2 types of meristem. There's primary meristem and there's secondary meristem. Primary meristem is found in the buds. This is what makes new roots, new shoots, leaves, flowers, fruit. It also makes new primary buds or new primary stem and new secondary meristem. The secondary meristem, or the cambium, is located right beneath the bark. And it makes the phloem and the xylem. So the cells of the secondary, so the cells in the cambium or the secondary meristem divide, and if they're moving out towards the outside of the tree, they differentiate into phloem tissue. If they move towards the inside of the tree, they differentiate into one of the variety of tissues you find in the xylem. The vascular tissue are in angiosperms, are vessel elements in gymnosperms are called tracheids. They operate a little bit differently. There's some differences in the macroscopic scale, but basically those are the tubes in the xylem that raise water from the roots to the crown. And then the phloem is also vascular tissue, and that's what moves sugar around in the tree. And the phloem is right underneath the bark. I'll show you a picture in a second. And then ground is sort of a catch-all category for everything that's not meristem or vascular. It can be the fibers, the wood fiber that gives wood its strength and makes it useful building material. Or it could be fibers in seeds or fruit. These are dead cells. So the fiber cell forms and immediately it dies, and all of the stuff inside the cell leaves. There's also epidermal cells. This is the outermost skin of the plant. It's not just bark, it's also the epidermis of the leaves, epidermis of the root system, and the epidermis of the new shoots. And what we see the epidermal doing, besides protecting the tree and keeping water in the tree, it also controls the gas and water exchange. In the leaves, you have stomata, which are pores that open and close to allow carbon dioxide to diffuse into the tree and oxygen and water vapor to diffuse out of the tree. There are also in the bark and in the non-leaf tissues, they also have lenticels, and those are pores where oxygen goes in and gas and carbon dioxide goes out. And a lot of the lenticels are located in the root system. Dan already mentioned plants need oxygen that they get from the soil. There's the parenchyma, and this is where a lot of stuff is going on because it's varied. You have parenchyma in the leaves. In the leaves, this is the stuff between the epidermal, the upper and the lower skin of the leaf. That's where the photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplasts, which are in the palisade parenchyma. But the parenchyma is also used for carbohydrate storage. So sugar goes into the parenchyma, gets converted into starch and stored until it's needed. and it's where defensive and regulatory chemicals are produced. The regulatory chemicals kind of control how the plant grows. So if you'll remember, I said that the vascular tissue is the vessel elements and tracheids, not the entire, all of the xylem is not vessel elements or vascular tissue. So this is a micrograph of water oak. And if you look at it, all of this line here is where the cambium is or was, because obviously this is dead and those cells have died. All of this to the inside, which is the wood of the tree, is xylem tissue. And in the xylem, you can see these big pits or holes. Those are the vessel elements. So that's the vascular tissue in the xylem. But surrounding all the vascular tissue, and there are smaller vessel elements in these lines that run radially, there's parenchyma that controls the flow of water and keeps these tubes functioning and moving water up. You also have parenchyma in the wood fiber, which is the darker brown stuff. And this is where those chemicals, those defensive and regulatory chemicals, are produced. And you also get parenchyma that forms into these flat plates of all parenchymal cells, and we call these parenchymal rays. These are important for the defense of the tree, but they are also a site of carbohydrate storage. So you can see it is connected. These parenchymal rays are connected to the phloem tissue, which is this stuff it's really kind of hard to differentiate between the phloem and the bark. But the sugar will come in here and it will be converted into starch and stored there. And then this area on the outside is the bark, and the phloem is the first, just this little inside area. It's hard to distinguish between the phloem and the bark, because what happens is after a growing season or two, the phloem actually gets crushed into, it dies and becomes part of the bark. So if you look at a cross section of a tree, starting at the outside, you've got the outer bark, then that phloem where you have sugars moving, and then the cambium that makes the new xylem and the new phloem. And then you have two types of xylem here. One is called sapwood. This is living xylem, so there are living parenchymal cells in there. And remember, the parenchymal cells are cells that don't divide, as opposed to the meristem, which is living cells that do divide. So you've got living parenchyma within the sapwood, which is xylem, and then you have heartwood, where the parenchyma has died. So there is nothing alive in the heartwood. And as the inner layer of sapwood is converted to heartwood, it gets filled with a lot of defensive chemicals, those toxins I mentioned, as well as may have some kind of physiological change. This is a white oak stump, and one of the physiological changes is as the xylem, the living xylem, goes from sapwood to heartwood, is it blows out these things called piloses, which are essentially airbags, and that clogs up those old vascular tubes and makes it harder for fungus to move up and down if it manages to get in and infect the heartwood. As I said, this is a white oak stump. It was about 6 months earlier the tree had been cut, and you can see the heartwood is this light cream colored section, and then the sapwood is this darker section. The reason the sapwood is darker here, normally it's lighter than the heartwood, but it's darker now because for 6 months, all of the carbohydrates in this tree have been exposed without any defenses in the sapwood, but you've got is in the heartwood. and then the brown is the bark of the tree. So how do trees grow? Well, remember, the meristem is the only tissue that can differentiate, can make new cells. The primary meristem in trees and other woody plants is located at the end of the branch in what we call buds, or at the end of the root, where there's also a bud. And what will happen in the next couple of weeks, that will begin to activate. I'll show you a graphic of that in a second. Then the secondary meristem is in the cambium, and it makes the wood. So what happens is, and the tree is getting ready to do this, this blue is a sprout from last year. And it's got a terminal bud there, which has primary meristem in it. In a few more weeks, that is going to wake up. It's going to start making a lot of new cells. You'll see the buds start to swell, and eventually the bud will break and we'll get a new shoot. And that new shoot is going to have cortex, and they're going to be connected to the, it's got vascular tissue in it, it's got an epidermis. It may have some buds on the side that turn into leaves. Usually there will be some what we call axillary buds below that terminal bud that will create new shoots that work out this way. But after that shoot elongates and the primary meristem gets done growing, the secondary meristem kicks in and starts making the tree bigger around by growing a new layer of wood over last year's growth. Now, one of the cool things about trees is that they are modular. So it doesn't matter whether this is a twig at the end of a branch of a 100-year-old oak tree, or whether it is a brand new sprout that germinated last year. You still see the same thing happening in the tree. All right. Here is a very basic outline of the energy system in a tree. The plants in the leaves, the tree creates biochemical energy from solar energy. That's photosynthesis that makes sugar. So you have sunlight coming in, it's getting trapped in the molecular bonds of the sugar. That sugar then, along with water and nutrients, gets moved around the plant through the vascular system. Eventually, that sugar winds up in a living cell, either parenchyma or a meristemal cell, where it is burned in the presence of oxygen through the process of cellular respiration and produces ATP. Now, if you look at the chemical equations, it looks like cellular respiration is just the reverse of photosynthesis. But it's not, because if it were, trees would glow. They would be giving off light. What's happening is the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are converting sunlight into these energetic ATP molecules. And these ATP molecules are what fuels the biochemistry in the cell. So they go to the ribosomes, and the ribosomes take the information from the DNA, and they build whatever molecules are needed out of the nutrients that the plant receives. And this is what fuels cellular repair and the creation of those defensive chemicals and the creation of plant regulating chemicals. And if it's meristem, building new tissues. So keep in mind that photosynthesis takes place in the parenchyma and respiration takes place in the parenchyma and the meristem. And these two processes together are what drive the life functions of the tree. You frequently will hear advertisements for fertilizer, and they talk about feeding the tree. I think not feed a tree or feed your grass, because the distinction between plants and almost all other organisms on the planet is a process of photosynthesis that allows them to make their own sugar and their own food. That's all I'm going to say about tree physiology. In terms of tree identification, what you may see on your test is something that looks like this, a bunch of pictures of the same plant, and you'll be asked to identify that. Hopefully, all of you can identify this just by looking at it, but all the salient information is here. Any questions right now, Ashley?
Not so far. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about, but if we do have any
Okay.
questions, I'll let you know.
All right. So we're going to move on to forest ecology. And as I read through this, a lot of this relates to some of the stuff that Dan talked about. It's basically, how do trees distribute themselves in the landscape? And so it's good that you did soils first, because there's going to be some repetition here. But before we get to that, we talk about what a forest looks like. And there are layers in the forest, right? We have the canopy, the understory, the shrub, and the ground layer. And these are essentially identified by the plants that are growing there. And one of the things that you should understand is that in a forest, all of the trees in the canopy, or trees of a canopy species, will be found in the understory, the shrub, and the ground layer as younger specimens of those species. Now, some forests, like an early successional forest, where you have one set of species that are dominant and co-dominant, you may have intermediate and suppressed species that are different, that are going to replace those canopy species. But in the ground level, you should have seedlings of all of the types of trees and shrubs that grow there, as well as the herbaceous. The shrub layer is where you have the small woody plants, plus the young specimens of understory or canopy species. We also talk about something in forestry called crown classes. The way I learned this, and the way that it makes most sense and is easiest, is if you think about the canopy of the tree as a cube, then you have dominant trees get full sunlight, or have 4 to 5 sides of their canopy cube exposed to the sun. It can't have 6 sides because the bottom is always shaded if by the canopy of the tree. So with a dominant species, you're looking at a tree that's sticking up above everything else. Co-dominant is only going to have 2 or 3 sides, usually the top and 1 or 2 sides exposed. Intermediate are the trees that are just breaking into the canopy, so only the top surface is exposed. And suppressed have no surfaces exposed to the sunlight. When we think about what a tree needs to grow, in particular, we're going to talk a lot about the abiotic factors, because that is as or more important, this is probably more important than the biotic factors. So going back to the tree physiology, we already talked about how sunlight, carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, nutrients are important to the tree. Sunlight can be a deciding factor in where a tree grows based on its shade tolerance. Carbon dioxide at this point in time really doesn't have much effect on the distribution of trees. The amount of oxygen and the type of soil you have is also going to be a determinant, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Water is needed for the biology, but it also can affect oxygen availability. As Dan mentioned, those soils that are saturated, which is pretty much all of our soils today, are going to have low oxygen availability, and that will affect what trees grow where. Also, the available of nutrients. Dan mentioned the parent material and the clay formation and organic matter, and the importance of those in holding nutrient and supplying nutrients to the soil and holding them in place. Mainly, it's because clay and organic matter have a negative charge, so they're going to hold on to positive cations of nutrients as well as their molecules. Temperature is also an important thing. We all know we've got different kinds of trees that grow, say, in a boreal forest in the Arctic than grow in a tropical rainforest. Excuse me, temperature is part of that. It affects the ability of the tree to survive the winter. So especially in places where it gets really cold, trees have devised some really cool strategies to keep ice crystals from the cells and to keep from freezing. But temperature also affects seed germination and seed stratification. I was doing a presentation last week, and a woman asked why she gets lots of maples and cherries sprouting in her garden, but she doesn't get any of the eastern white pine, even though she has a bunch of eastern white pine there. And I did some research, and I found out it probably doesn't get cold enough in the winter for those eastern white pine seeds to properly stratify so the embryo can break open the seed and begin to grow and germinate. And fire also has an effect. Different areas with different weather patterns get more or less fire. Fire can affect competition, survival, but there are some species that need a fire to burn off all of that O layer, the organic matter, and expose the more mineral soil for germination. And then there are some species, not too many in Virginia, but pines in particular, that need fire to open up their cones so the seeds can get out. And what we'll see is that too much or too little of any of these things can create stress in the tree, and different species are adapted to different stressors. So just to amplify something Dan said, this is a chart that I came across that you don't need to memorize this, although that would be a really cool question, would be to put some blanks in this chart and ask you to fill them in. But I don't think I'll do that. It'd be too much work. But the idea is to look at these and notice that different types of parent material lead to different concentrations of nutrients. So for example, Dan mentioned some diabase ultramafic rocks in Western Fairfax that have a lot of magnesium in them, whereas comparatively, these sedimentary rocks have very little. So that's going to affect your trees. Climate change will also have an effect on trees. Now, there are a lot of people who talk about the fertilizer effect of increased CO2 levels. And in the laboratory, where we're controlling everything and focusing only on the effect of CO2, we get pretty good results. I mean, we're looking at more sugar produced, more plant growth, and less water usage when we have more carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, when we're thinking about trees out in the wild, along with elevated CO2, we get elevated temperatures. And there we get a mixed result because, yes, we're getting a little more sugar, we're getting a lot more growth. And one of the things you got to be that this is worrisome is if we are increasing growth by that much relative to the increase in sugar, it is possible that these trees can outgrow their resources, use up all their reserves, and try to grow more than they can be supported by their sugar production. And there are actually some pesticide or herbicides, 2,4-D works that way. It causes the plant to just grow so much it uses up all the carbohydrate resource and then dies. And the other thing is we go from decreasing water usage to increasing water usage by as much as 50% with those elevated temperatures. So it's not clear that climate change is going to be good for any or all species of tree. all that aside, when we think about where trees grow in the landscape, they grow where they have a competitive advantage. So for example, this is a picture of bald cypress I took down in Florida, and bald cypress is renowned for growing in standing water. It doesn't grow there because it needs a lot of water. It grows there because it is adapted to very low oxygen levels around its root system. In other words, it grows in standing water because other trees can't, because that low oxygen in the root zone is a stressor on the tree. So that's where it has a competitive advantage. And Dan already alluded to this. Most of the trees want to grow at the mid slope. This is where you have deep, rich, moist, well-drained soils. And all of the trees, regardless of where you find them in nature, will grow well in that site. Unfortunately, that also tends to be where that would be a really crowded area. So some species have learned to go upslope, where because of gravity and other things that Dan talked about, we tend to find thin, dry, infertile soils. That is obviously a stressor. Less moisture, less nutrients, and not as deep a soil as you would find, say, in the mid slope. When you get to the bottom of the slope, now you've got really deep, thick soils, but they tend to stay wet for a long time. So that's where you have those anoxic conditions. So what we find growing up at the top of the slope, and we see these conditions in some soils, for example, in the coastal plain where you have deep, really sandy soils that infiltrate the water too well, you'll find these communities that are mostly dryland oaks and or plants in the heath family, ericaceous shrubs like rhododendrons and mountain laurels and azaleas. That's where they grow. And this is also going to affect some other things we'll talk about later on. Availability of sun, of course, is going to have an effect on trees. And this is a question I get all the time. Somebody points at a tree and says, how old do you think that tree is? 1, 2, 300 years? Well, I can't tell because here we have 2 white oak tree cookies. These are cross sections of 2 trees. This one has 34 growth rings in it. This one only has 7. The difference is this one was growing in the shade, this one was growing in the sun. So the availability of sunlight has a real effect on where trees can grow. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Fire is another issue. There are some plants that are what we call obligate fire species. They require fire in order to complete their life cycle. This picture here is one that I took at, it was at Yosemite, I think, or it was a sequoia, but this is a sequoia pine cone. And as you can see, this is one of the species that has these serotinous cones that need fire to open them up. As I said, some plants need mineral soil for germination, so they need the fire to come through and clear off that O layer as it burns. And also the heat and smoke and fire also is a tremendous decomposer and releases a lot of nutrients that are bound up in plant matter. We don't have many obligate fire species in Virginia. There are a few in the mountains that require fire for germination. One of the plants that may be an obligate fire species is mountain laurel. It needs the fire to come through and regenerate and renew that stand every now and then. However, we do have fire in Virginia, and we have plants that are adapted to fire. So here are 2 pines, eastern white pine on the left, loblolly pine on the right. Eastern white pine stands burn maybe once every century. Loblolly pine stands burn once every decade. Notice when we take them out of the forest and we grow them in the open, the eastern white pine maintains its branches all the way down to the ground. This is not a problem when you only have fire once a century, because what can happen is if this grass field catches on fire, that fire can jump into these lower branches and climb its way up into the canopy and kill the tree. Loblolly pine, on the other hand, when it's open grown, will shed those branches to prevent that kind of ladder fuel and the fire from climbing into the canopy. This tree was not pruned. This is in our seed tree orchard down in I forget the name of it. I'm getting old. Nouns get away from. But that tree just naturally pruned off all those lower branches. Bark is another adaptation. You all know that trees put on growth rings every year. Well, the bark also puts on growth rings, and you can see in this loblolly pine bark, you can see these plates, and you can see there are lots of plates stacked on top of each other. Each one of those plates represents one growing season. So this bark, this outer plate, could have been attached to this tree for 20, 30, maybe, or for 20 or 30 years. You get the same kind of plating going on with oaks and even with beeches. The difference is this beech tree has really smooth bark because it sheds those outer plates very readily. Therefore, it has a really thin bark. And if a fire comes along, it doesn't have much thermal protection. And what will happen is the cambium right below the bark will get cooked off, and that tree will die, whereas the oak and the loblolly have the thermal protection to keep their cambium safe from the fire. We do get some biotic factors that affect the distribution of the forest. One of the most important things are the seed dispersers. So in the must have got rid of that. So in the early successional pioneer forests, what you will see is most of those pioneer trees, which are very shade intolerant and they have wing seeds and are dispersed by wind. A lot of our mid-successional species have large seeds like acorns or hickory nuts, and they're dispersed by squirrels and corvids, which are a group of birds, in particular blue jays, that have a natural caching behavior. And so what will happen is they will pick up those acorns and they'll move them into areas and they'll plant them. So what we see is those early successional species, those pioneer species, create habitat that squirrels and blue jays will go into, and they'll bring the seeds with them. The other issue is big biotic factor for seed dispersal are the frutivores. So these would be the birds particularly that eat berries, and they digest the pulp and they poop out the seed in a nice nutrient-rich mixture and give that seed a good start. So if we lose those seed dispersers, and we are having a lot of problems, not so much with squirrels and blue jays and crows, but with a lot of our fruit-eating birds are disappearing, and part of it is deer herbivory. We'll talk about this more with forest management, but the deer have a big impact on the forest because once the population gets big enough, they start eating the entire shrub layer. And that's where a lot of our forest birds like to nest. So the deer are eating the nesting areas. Dan talked about the soil microbes. I don't know if specifically mentioned mycorrhizal fungi. These are special fungi that form a symbiotic relationship with the tree. and the fungi is giving water and nutrients to the tree, and the tree is giving it sugars. And the trees are trying to attract a lot of these soil microbes through what we call root exudates. Essentially, it's sugar that's leaking out of the tree. And as Dan mentioned, when we over fertilize, particularly if we give the plant fertilize or too much phosphorus, it will stop attracting those mycorrhizal fungi. And then when because it doesn't need them for the phosphorus. And so they get, I think Dan said they get lazy. But it's important to attract those microbes. As Dan said, there's a lot of warfare going on among the microbes, but just having a dense mat of non-pathogenic microbes on the root surface creates a barrier that the pathogens have to get through. We have pests and diseases. The native pests and diseases are not really a big factor as far as the distribution of trees because the trees have evolved with them. So these things usually are only attacking trees that are already stressed. You can think of the pests and the diseases as sort of like the wolves. The wolves go after the old and the lame and the sick deer that are easy to catch. And the same thing with our native pests and diseases. But when we non-native invasive species, particularly, the plants are competing with our native plants for space, and a lot of the pests and diseases, which are just kind of cleaning up the gene pool in their native lands, become very virulent. They can attack and kill mature trees. Things like emerald ash borer and chestnut blight, that's one pest and one disease that are wiping out an entire genus of plants in our ecosystem because they don't have the evolutionary experience to deal with them. All right, let's talk about sustainable forest management. And we're going to just jump right past that. Managing forests. We're talking about managing space for trees because space means access to sunlight, access to water, and access to nutrients. When we're out in a rural forest, what most people think of as forests, mainly we're talking about manipulating the distribution of trees to create space for trees we want to favor. In the urban forest, we still have competition between trees for space, but trees are also competing with a lot of stuff that we build and a lot of uses that we have for space where they can grow and get the sunlight, water, and nutrients that they need. So buildings and hardscapes, utilities, stormwater facilities, recreation fields, and lawns. We grow about 40 million acres of lawn in the United States. That is the single largest irrigated crop that we have. So that is a big issue in urban forestry because trees and turf grass do not get along. Trees like cool, moist, fungally dominated soils. Turf grass likes warm, dry, bacterially dominated soils, and they're both working to create those conditions in the soil. Dan already talked about how plants affect soils. So when we look at rural forestry, we're trying to think of, I said we're going providing space for trees. Well, then the question is, what trees are we going to provide space for? We can answer that question chronologically in terms of we're trying to provide space for trees or we're trying to provide space for young trees. And when we're looking at young trees, it could be existing trees or it could be future trees. We can also answer that question by species. We may be interested in the value of the species or the habitat value of the species or some other value that we put on them. We can also talk about the form. For example, people ask me about managing for bald eagles. Well, bald eagles need large trees to build their nests in, but they also need what they call spy trees, which is a similarly sized dead tree that they can perch in and survey the landscape looking for something to eat. When you are doing forest management, particularly sustainable forest management, the first you need to do is have a plan. You need to think about, what are my goals and objectives? What am I trying to accomplish on this forest parcel? And when you answer that question, it may be answering the question of, what kind of trees do you want to provide space for? The second step in the plan is to ask or figure out, what's the current state of the forest? This is where we get into data collection and analysis. We look, and it essentially tells us where the forest is now and what's missing. And then the plan is, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? So for example, this is I wrote a plan for this property, and the landowner was interested in doing some commercial forestry. Stand A has a lot of fairly young white oak in it, not big enough to harvest. But stand B, which is all this, has a lot of harvestable saw timber size tulip poplar. So I made some recommendations about how he would manage that. One of the other things you need to keep in mind is forestry takes time. If we are managing for hardwood, we're looking at rotations of anywhere from 40 to 125 years. So if you start planting hardwoods, you're planting for your grandchildren. Pines is 20 to 50 years. So if you're planting pines, you may be planting for your children. When we go out into the field, what most people don't think about is, what data do I need to answer the questions that we posed as to where we are now and where we need to go? If you're talking with a landowner who's not interested in commercial harvesting, growth rate is not really that important. That's only important because one of the economic factors in commercial timber management is, how is the rate of growth of the tree compared to the interest rate? And you might not think that that would be the way that would be important, but if you think about the trees standing in the forest as potentially being turned into money in the bank, if the trees are growing faster than the interest rate, then you're better off leaving the trees to grow, because you're going to increase your return later on relative to selling the trees and putting them in the bank and letting the money grow that way. The goals and objectives would also affect data collection by how we do it. So for some plans, walking through the field and taking notes on the species, the stocking density, the age of the forest is adequate. Other times we need to do plots. And when we do plots, we're typically doing either a fixed radius plot, which would be 5% cruise. We look at 5% of it, and those fixed radius plots would be 1/10 of an acre. So if you're looking at, say, 20 acres, 5% would be 4 plots. No, 10 plots. We can do variable radius plots, and for that we use a tool like you see in this picture. It's called a prism. And if you notice, as you look through this prism, you can see how the bole of the tree has been shifted inside the prism. If the bole of if this part that got shifted was not shifted far enough to not be completely outside the top and bottom part, it would be part of your variable radius plot. As it is, this one is right on the edge. And so what you do is you might you don't count the first one, then you count the second one. But that's how this prism works. It's a really handy tool because you can just go around and count the number of trees and then multiply by the factor of the prism. This is what it looks like. So the 10 factor prism, if you counted 12 trees as being in your plot, your basal area, which is the sum of the cross sections of the trees, would be 120. This is a tool called an angle gauge. It works pretty much the same way. You put this in this rubber thing in your teeth, and you hold it out so that you're looking at it from the right distance. And then any tree that the outer edges are wider than the gap here would count. And this one has a 5, 10, and a 20 factor. So depending on which one you want to use. And as you can see with the 20 factor, you're going to have a lot fewer trees. The other way to do basal area is to just, in a fixed diameter plot, you measure the diameter of the trees, and you solve for the sum of the cross sections through pi r squared. When we're measuring tree diameters, there are really two different tools. This is called the diameter tape. It is specifically for measuring the diameter of the tree. This is a logger's tape. We also use this for surveying. This has a much bigger tape in it than this one. And if you notice down here on both of them, it has this smaller scale, which is tenths of a foot. So that one is 1.1 feet, not 1 foot, 1 inch. It also has a larger scale, which is in units of pi, which makes it really convenient because you can just read the diameter of the tree off of that pi scale, and you don't have to do the conversion. And then the other tool we have is the Biltmore Stick, which can be used to measure the diameter of the tree. This is in English, so it's measuring in inches. There's also a metric Biltmore Stick that measures in meters. We might also want to know the tree. This is the classic planometer used for measuring height. We also use it for measuring, for doing some survey and measuring the heights of hills. This is an electronic one. The advantage of this one is you don't have to worry about your battery dying out in the middle of the forest. But we can also use the Biltmore Stick to measure the height of the trees. The other tool we sometimes use is an increment borer. Essentially what you're doing with this, and we try not to use it too much because we're creating a wound and a way to get pathogens deep into the tree. But this is what we do is we drill this into the tree, and it's got this tube is hollow, and we can pull out a little tree core and count the rings and look at how they're the Biltmore Stick is the original forest management tool. As I said, you can measure diameter, you can measure saw timber height in logs, pulp timber height in feet. You can scale cut logs. That means you can measure the diameter of the short end. And most of them have both the Doyle rule, which is for cut logs, and the 1/4 inch international rule for standing timber to determine board volume on them. The other thing that's handy about it is you can beat back thorny plants, spider webs, and small animals and things like that. So it's a really handy tool, especially if you don't like walking through the woods and getting spider webs on your face. So let's talk about space management techniques. Now, one of the things they talk about in that guide is clear cuts. They keep talking about clear cuts. We don't use that term anymore. We call it a regeneration cut. And we've got seed tree, shelter wood, thinning from below, from above, single tree selection, and what we sometimes call patch clear cuts or group selects. So let's look at these things. If
Jim,
you
can I
look
ask
up,
you a question real quick?
sure,
So you showed us a lot of different equipment, which is all going to be really helpful as we're preparing for the forestry test in Envirothon. This year,
right,
we probably won't use a lot of it in person because we're not going to be measuring trees in person. But if we were
right.
looking for maybe one or two pieces of equipment that we really should know how to use because you may test on it or because we might find it valuable, what are maybe like the one or two or three tools that you think are the most important to know how to use?
The tool I use the most is diameter tape, and the prism wedge. Um, if you're going to do timber cruising, the diameter bore is also important for determining growth rates of the trees. That's important for your plan. I really, other than to put up a picture and say, what is this and what is it used for? I'm not sure how I would test you on those things. They do keep asking us to teach you how to use the Biltmore Stick. That is a very tricky tool to use. The diameter tape is dead easy. You just wrap the tape around the tree and read the numbers off the tape. It's just like measuring something with a ruler. So, I would think about how, because the Biltmore Stick is really, really complicated in its use. And over the past 16 years, I've found that to be one of the toughest skills for the Envirothon teams to master. So I would think that for this test, you should know what all those tools are and what they're used for. Not necessarily how to use them, because aside from giving them to you and saying, show me how to use this, I'm not quite sure I'd test you on that.
All right, that's pretty fair.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So when we are thinking about creating space for future trees, this is where we use a regeneration cut. We usually use this for pioneer species. And so what we're doing is we are removing the entire top, the entire forest from the ground layer up, and that's going to create the right conditions for seeds of those pioneer species to germinate. So what we're doing is creating space for those ungerminated seeds. Typically, these pioneer species will not germinate in the forest, either because they need contact with mineral soils or because they're not getting enough light to germinate. In Virginia, we do have something called the seed tree law, which requires that you leave behind mature trees to provide seed when you are harvesting loblolly or eastern white pine. Now, there are some exceptions to it. One is you can have an alternative management plan, which I'll talk about in a minute, kind of. And that is that usually, especially with loblolly pine, instead of going for regeneration by seed, we plant the trees. But as I said, these regeneration cuts are typically used for these pioneer species that need full sun. So to be pine, we'd also do this for poplar. And when we're managing pine, this is a typical timeline. Suppose you harvested last year in 2020. The first step in managing that pine plantation is at the end of this summer, we do a site preparation spray using a helicopter, and we use a cocktail of herbicides that will kill grasses, it'll kill broadleaf, it'll kill pine. We want to kill everything that grows, that sprouts and germinates and comes up on that site during that first growing season. In the winter, we might do a site burn. And what that's going to do is it's going to eliminate the slash. It's going to burn up all that plant material. It's going to decompose all that stuff really quickly. So it's going to be putting nutrients into the soil. Getting rid of the slash is also useful when we get out into those fields and try and plant them. And then March 2022 is when we would plant with, and I probably have to update this. I think we have 4th generation loblolly. And this is why people tend to go with planting rather than natural regeneration by seed. First of all, we can control the number of stems out there. we plant 396, 435, or 484. This is 9 or 10 by 11, 10 by 10, or 10 by 9 spacing. The other thing is that those pines you harvested in 2020 were probably first generation. What I mean by that is the Virginia Department of Forestry and other forestry agencies in the Southeast, as well as a lot of the research institutions like Virginia Tech and Clemson and some of the other land grant universities, have been involved in a selective breeding problem or program for loblolly pine for the past 75 years. So what we're doing is we are selectively breeding to get a better commercial pine structure. It's still the same loblolly pine, but it tends to grow faster and have fewer branches, which makes it a more valuable tree. In 2024, we might come in and do a release spray. This would be to kill back the hardwood competition, which I guess is what they mean in the learning objectives by weeding. Where that came from, I have never heard a forester talk about weeding except for the guys at the nursery. What we find though, we do the site prep spray and the site prep burn, we don't have to do that release spray. Then about 2040, we'll do our commercial thinning where we're going to thin out those trees, sell them for pulpwood, leave behind a lot of trees that are then going to keep growing another 12 years or so, become saw timber, and that's when we do the regeneration harvest. And notice that is a 32-year space between the harvest we did last year and the next full harvest of the site. And then we can start over on the site with a site prep spray and planting what by then would be 4th or 5th generation loblollies. The other alternative might be to leave the wood understory to grow. And this is one of the ways we recommend if a landowner is interested in having a hardwood stand in the future. This is the cheapest and the best way, one of the best ways to get there. This is exploiting natural succession. When we talk about for existing young trees, this is where we start talking about shelter woods or possibly single tree selects or thinning from below. What we do in a shelter wood is we take out somewhere between 50 and 80% of the basal area of the overstory, and that's going to leave us with a wide open forest floor, which is going to get a lot of filtered sunlight, which would be good for those mid-successional species like oaks and hickory. Once those oaks and hickories get big enough, we can go in and take out the rest of the trees so they get the full sun they need to jump up and become canopy trees. On some stands, depending on the structure, what's going on, we might do what we call thinning from below. And in this case, what we're doing is going in and we're removing those understory or mid-story trees that are not desirable species, but are casting shade on the young seedlings that we're trying to improve or we're trying to encourage. And usually what we're doing is we're taking out things like maple and beech or holly. These are climax species that are very shade tolerant, and we're trying to make space for those young mid-successional species, which is predominantly oak and hickory. And we can do this thinning from below with fire. We can use fire as a tool to get rid of those climax species because they are the ones that have the thin bark and are not adapted to burning. So this gives you kind of a visual of what a shelter would look like. This stand was thinned down to 60% or a basal area of 60 square feet per acre. It doesn't look like it's doing much to project this because it has been recently burned, but this gives you an idea of what it would look like. And here is my colleague Kinner, who is he, by the way, is likely to be writing the area forestry plan or best, but he's cutting some small diameter. In fact, it was on this that we got that that tree cookie with the 34 and the 7-year-old tree. But we're trying to get rid of some of this mid-story trees to provide light for all of these young trees that are growing around here. This is out at Conway Robinson State Forest, and we've been hunting deer out there for about 12 years now, which is why we have that kind of growth. And like I said, we can use fire as a thinning tool. This site was burned weeks before I took this picture. This is southern red oak that's growing on that site, and you can see how readily it has resprouted, even though the fire top killed it. So that's one of the things that we, when we're managing for the oaks and hickories particularly, we can use fire to get rid of the competition for that regeneration. When we're trying to provide space for existing mature trees, this is where we get into something called thinning or single tree selection. Sometimes it's called crop tree release. Sometimes it's called timber stand improvement. And the idea here is you go out and you select your really good trees and you leave them behind and you cut the trees that are competing with them. At least that's the theory. Unfortunately, if you don't have good oversight of your loggers, what they're going to do, they're going to go out and they're going to cut the very best trees on your stand and leave behind the crap. And that's because when you do this, you are ideally, you're creating value, greater value in your stand 20 or 30 years from now. And that logger is going to be retired and he's not going to get the benefit. So there's a lot of economic incentive to remove the best trees when they do this. That's why we generally don't recommend this. That's what we call high grading, which we summarize as take the best and leave the rest, and it will degrade the value of your stand. Group selects are usually, we're talking about 1 to 5 acre openings. This is for wildlife. It's going to create meadow and edge species, and you get a lot of good biodiversity in there. We use fire as a management tool in meadows particularly, but also in forests. We're introducing disturbance. So those mid-successional trees like moderate disturbance, whereas the climax species don't like disturbance at all. And in addition to using it for thinning, it's also, as I've mentioned several times, decomposing agents. It's good for clearing or thinning lots of small or large spaces. This is down at Piney Grove Forest or Piney, what is it called? It's just called Piney Grove Conservancy project. They're managing this landscape for red-cockaded woodpeckers, and they purposely only burned one side of this fire break. They left this behind. This is what the forest would look like in the absence of fire every 2 or 3 years that they put into this stand. This, by the way, is dry and fertile soils. This would be planted in loblolly, but the natural, these are all these shrubs are heaths, and the natural overstory is white oak and southern red oak. And you can see how burning can affect the stand. This was burned 8 weeks before I took the picture. This was 4 years ago. And you can see how much regeneration you've gotten of the hardwoods in there. They also keep talking about coppicing. All I will say is that this is a forestry technique devised by and for medieval peasants who were managing for these sprouts. Nobody really does this in Virginia anymore. Some of the problems we run into with forest management is that, particularly with deer browse and non-native invasive species, when we're creating the space for those trees, we're also creating space for deer food and non-native invasive plants. And this can pretty much defeat what you're trying to do, because if you're trying to create space for young trees to grow in, and it gets taken over by the non-native invasive species, or it gets browsed out by the deer every time those little trees come up. You don't get the new forest that you're looking for. So this is what excessive deer browse looks like. Remember, there should be an understory, and there's not. This is what non-native invasive species can look like. In fact, this is a 40-acre parcel, and I recommend they clear the whole thing. It was so heavily invaded, but you can see these vines have killed this tree and are pulling it to the ground. And when you combine the two, you get a landscape that looks something like this. This is all stilt grass, not much in the way of native plants down at the ground level. Some of the other problems too is parcelization and fragmentation. So parcelization is where we take a large tract and break it up into a lot of small ownerships. It makes it hard to manage. Most of our commercial forestry is geared towards stands greater than 20 acres. So getting good forest management on these 5-acre plots that maybe someday in the future somebody's going to build a house on is difficult. Along with parcelization, we get fragmentation. This is where we up big blocks of forest into smaller ones. And I think you'll probably talk about this in wildlife, but you degrade the ability of genetics to flow between those different parts. Another problem that we have here in Northern Virginia is most of our service providers are getting old and their kids have seen the work and they know it's hard and they're not interested. So particularly our loggers, they're on it. We're probably on our last generation of loggers. And closing of mills, it was in the news a couple of years ago, a big mill in Cumberland, Maryland was closed. And that means then that we don't have a place to send trees when we harvest them. And in Northern Virginia, traffic is a big issue. I've talked with a lot of loggers who've come up and done a job here and said they never come back because of the traffic. There's also a NIMBY effect. Nobody wants this in their backyard. They don't want their neighbor's property to look like this, and I don't blame them. This is a clear cut in the middle of, or in the, it's in the process, is not a pretty thing. We have changing markets. The southeast of the United States is still considered the wood basket of the world. It is a great place to grow trees. However, we have a lot of competition around the world, and that has depressed timber prices. The biofuel market used to be a place where we could send some of the waste or the non-commercial wood, and that market has collapsed because of fracking. Natural gas is so cheap that biofuel is only used for peaking when we have high demand for electricity. One good thing is the increased interest in tea and wine has created a great market for white oak, which is needed to make barrels. We have been trying to push these non-wood forest products, things like shiitake mushrooms and agroforestry. And the Department of Forestry has started an urban wood project to try and get more service providers for those small lots. We also talk about, they also ask about even-aged and uneven-aged management. Even-aged management gets done more often because it's just cheaper than uneven-aged management. There are some problems with uneven-aged management, especially the high-grade I mentioned and multiple entries that can cause damage to the residuals. And sometimes we will combine these two on a larger property. We'll take, say, 100 acres and break it up into 10-acre stands, and we will number them 1 through 10, and every 10 years we will harvest one of them. So we start with 1 and we work our way around to 10, and then we go back to 1. But notice that's 100 years later that we're coming back to that first stand to harvest it again. But at that time we have 10 stands of different ages in there. When we talked about how soil conditions could affect the distribution of plants, we also start to see increases in biodiversity as we move down the slope and get into those deeper, richer soils. Unfortunately, we also see increases in non-native invasive plants. So as we get increases in non-native invasive plants and increases in deer browse, we tend to see a reduction in biodiversity, despite what would naturally be happening. We do have some new technology out there. This is a cool, with laser range finding those things, this little tool can measure both the height and the basal area of a tree. I'm not quite sure how it works. This thing costs $1,500. My bosses won't pay for it. But we also are using drones. We have several certified drone or licensed drone in the department. There are some arboriculture companies are using drones for crown inspections, so they can send this thing up and look for pests and diseases in the crown. We don't do that so much, but we do use it for looking at outbreak assessment. So if we have a small plot and we want to see how far, for example, how big a problem pine bark beetles are in there, we can fly that overhead and look for and see how many dead trees there are. And we use it in firefighting. We can get an aerial view of the fire, get an idea of where it's burning and what's going on. One more section is trees as an important renewable resource. When we look at urban trees, we get a lot of environmental benefits from them. We also get these benefits. So those environmental benefits, these we find mostly we talked about tree physiology and all of this stuff. This is what happens as trees grow and we value it. A lot of this in the urban areas is because this is how we interact with trees, particularly this last bullet. Most of the research that on the benefits of the urban forest is being published in public health journals. There are a lot of threats to our trees. This was another one of those learning points. In particular, restricted soil volumes and compacted soils. Dan talked a lot about that and how that affects the soils, but also microclimates, poor drainage that's usually associated with compacted soils, and mechanical damage, and also bad management practices. So this tree is growing in a parking lot island. It's got restricted soil volume. The soil it does have is probably compacted. It's in a microclimate because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of heat coming off of this parking lot, particularly in the summer. It probably doesn't drain very well, and it's going to be subject to mechanical damage from automobiles in particular. This is a nice mulch circle, so it's probably not going to get weed whacker or lawnmower damage, but car doors and the somebody who this is at and anyway, somebody who jumps that curb could do a lot of damage. And you can see this tree and these two trees back here were all the same species, planted at the same time, the same cultivar, the same species. These are planted in large soil volumes. They look very nice. This one planted in this island, you can already see there's a big gap, a hole in the canopy, so it's already declining. Some other things, I don't know what the person was thinking when they did this. If I were there and got hold of them, I would put them on the rack and ask them. Might subject them to the beginning of a death by 1,000 cuts, because that's what they have done to this tree. This tree, this lovely lady did not do this to the tree. You can see these other trees in the background are in full leaf. The top of this tree is dead. You've got sprouts down here, and that's because they left the cable on the tree and it girdled and killed the top of the tree. Ecosystem services. I'm just going to categories. There's provisioning. These are things that we get from the tree, from the forest, like wood fiber and game, non-wood products, and water quantity. Dan talked a lot about the water cycle and how that works. So a service would be the amount of water. Regulating service would be the quality of the water, as well as soil management, carbon storage. These are things that we benefit from the forest from. And then there are cultural amenities, things like hiking and camping and wildlife viewing, and just the existence value, the fact that the forest is out there, we derive benefit from, and also tourism. And then these are the things that keep the ecosystem going: photosynthesis and nutrient cycling and water cycling. And notice how much of this is stuff that happens in the soils. So if we look at it in kind of a diagram, I saw this on the internet, the supporting services are here. That's what keeps the ecosystem supported. And then we get these other types of ecosystem services. And there's my contact information. And I know we have gone over, but if any of you are, I see there are still a few people out there. If you've got any questions, I'm willing to hang around and answer them.
Thank you, Jim. That was awesome. That was a really good presentation that had a lot of stuff that I think probably a lot of our teams haven't seen before. So that was really nice.
Okay.
I did have a question actually
All
about
right.
forestry, because our special topic is related to water resources management. What's the most important role that trees and the forest would play in managing our drinking water?
Well, it actually goes back to Dan's lecture where he talked about how plants and things can affect the texture of the soil, not the texture of the soil, but the structure of the soil, and create those PEDs. I mentioned that trees like deep, rich, moist, well-drained soil, and most people don't notice moist, well-drained soil seems like kind of an oxymoron, but the trees interacting with that soil ecosystem allows it to function better, allows for the infiltration of the water, but it allows it to be held as well by the aggregate formation. And trees do a lot to support that, but they also support the bacteria and the fungi that help with that formation and also help clean the water as it goes through there. The other thing that trees do that is not as well appreciated is the leaf litter from the trees is the basis of the aquatic food web in your mountain Piedmont streams. It's not as important in the coastal plain streams, but any of those streams that are that have closed canopy over them, that leaf litter is really important in feeding the microbes that then process the nitrogen and phosphorus that's in the water column. And then, of course, feed the higher organisms that use up some of that stuff too. So that's the role that trees play in protecting water quality.